First of all, I'd like to thank Sam for inviting me here to this conference. It is a great honor to be here and among our, see many very familiar friends and faces in the audience, and always a pleasure to be back in Baku. I also would very much like to thank the moderator of the panel, Zohar Sharif, for moderating this panel and also asking me to participate in the conference. I consider Zohar to be one of many young Azerbaijani experts who are becoming very well known in the West and have many bright and innovative ideas. And I think much of the future of Azerbaijan depends on this new young generation of Azerbaijani experts that are becoming involved in security affairs and analysis. I am the president of the Jamestown Foundation. I work in Washington, D.C. The foundation I had has been in existence for over 20 years. We write a lot about the region of the Caspian region, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. I myself have been involved in this area and studying the region for over 15 years. And it's a great honor to get the opportunity to travel to this region quite frequently and to see the changes that have emerged in the Caucasus in the many years that I've been following it. Much of what I've seen in the region has been shaped by oil and energy. I've been in places like Chechnya, and I've been into Nagorno-Karabakh, visited the front lines of Azerbaijani military positions and seen things there. And I've traveled, been to parts of Central Asia. So there's always, this region is a very vast importance to the security of the United States and American national interests in this region. The title of my presentation today was, I was asked to speak about 20 years after independence and talk about the geopolitical rivalry over the region. I've spent a lot of time in recent years thinking and viewing the region and trying to understand the strategic dynamics of the Caucasus and the dynamics of what's going on in Russia, how it affects the region, what's happening in Turkey. And I think that when you look at this region now, it's very important to understand that it's, Azerbaijan is a crossroads. It's a crossroads between East and West. It's a crossroads of the Caspian. And it's very important that there's a lot of different players and countries influencing events in this region. And I think that when you look back in the past 20 years, what you've seen in the Caucasus and elsewhere in what we call the post-Soviet space is what we call the institution of state building. You've seen these countries become independent overnight, and they have literally been created trying to develop a nation basically when nothing existed. That goes from everything from providing for medical health care to education to building an army to establishing embassies overseas. And this is all a very important process, and it takes really 20 years to achieve this. I think there are certain states in history that have become, in the case of the Baltic states, who had a period of independence and became very westernized, joined the West, and now members of NATO. And I think that when you look at the South Caucasus, you need to take into perspective that these countries of this region did not enjoy the opportunities. Their independence was very short-lived in the 1920s. 1918 to 1920, it was very short-lived, but they later, by 1991, had achieved a chance to, again, to regain their statehood. So I think this part is very important. When you start to talk about security in this region, you have to start with very basic things. In the case of Azerbaijan and Georgia, the key things was the ability to reorient their infrastructure. And this was a process of building pipelines, railroads, everything that previously ran north through a north-south axis suddenly had to be reoriented to a new direction, and that was towards Europe. And this east-west axis of development required a long period of time to develop. Baku-Ceyhan-Tbilisi pipeline is considered to be one of the major developments in the past 20 years. It was later followed by the Shah Deniz gas pipeline. Now we have the new TANAP project that is going on with Turkey and Azerbaijan. And now we have Azerbaijan with its new latest project and its agreement on the developments with the TAP pipeline, the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, that is involving Statoil and British Petroleum. And now you have a situation where the trade of the region is greatly changing. So here you have a situation where Azerbaijan is trying to develop relations and movement towards Europe, but at the same time, Azerbaijan is a gateway to Central Asia. And geography has really mandated and created much of the situation for Azerbaijan. And in this process of state building, you having entered into the picture a very difficult problem, and that's what we call in the West the frozen conflicts. These are the conflicts of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Moldova, and the Transnistria problem, and then you have the problem of Nagorno-Karabakh. And what you've seen in the case of Azerbaijan and Georgia is a deliberate effort to try to prevent these states from achieving their full nationhood. Much of their energy, attention, their refugees, in the case of Azerbaijan and Georgia, created a very devastating impact on the countries, on their national outlook, on their economies, and basically when you've seen countries divided by conflict, you've seen there is a precedent in this, and that was the case of Germany being divided between East and West Germany. It was designed in a way so that Germany could not attain its full role in Europe, and Germany overcame that process. West Germany became a member of NATO. West Germany became the economic engine of Europe. And now when you look today, the situation in the Caucasus, you see the country like Azerbaijan with its vast energy potential and wealth. It is now the economic engine of the Caucasus. 75% of all the, Today, Azerbaijan is 75% of all the economic investment in the South Caucasus is coming from Azerbaijan. It is now the economic engine of growth in the region. So much like Germany, Azerbaijan is becoming a key economic power in this region. During this period of time, you've seen also outside interest by NATO and the United States in developing security ties to the South Caucasus. There was a great hope that NATO would somehow come in and provide and fill the security vacuum of this region that would prevent the situation from worsening. NATO developed, and the United States developed programs called the Partnership for Peace program as a way to reach out to these newly independent states to give them an ability to develop military ties and security and establish these ties with the West. This has been one of the main pillars of security for the United States in this region. You also have to understand that when you think about this region, the United States and also in many countries in Europe did not have a very good understanding of what this region of the world meant. Many policymakers today, they use the phrase the stands to refer to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, to basically describe this region in a terminology that they just as this small area of the world that they really, when they look at the rest of the world, they don't really have much of an interest in it and what goes on in this part of the Caucasus and Central Asia. But American policymakers had a similar situation in understanding this region or understanding this part of the world that began in the 1940s. In 1946, they had an incident called the Straits Crisis involving Turkey, in the Soviet Union, and a development that led to a crisis with the West that created a new understanding and in terms of how the United States looked at this part of the world. And at that time, Americans did not understand what was going on in Greece with the upheaval in the Greek communist movement in the Balkans. They didn't understand what was going on in Iranian Azerbaijan. There was a crisis there in 1947 with the departure of Soviet troops. And many American policymakers did not understand that part of the world. But gradually they did begin to understand this part of the world. And I compare the situation now to what was happening in the 1940s in the sense that Americans did not really fully understand it. And that begins the next phase of American policy and that ended in the 1990s. It began in 2001 with the tragic events of 9/11. That began a new phase in terms of how the United States looked at this region. It began to look at it in terms of transportation routes and supplying of American troops and NATO forces in Afghanistan. American supplies started going through Russia. They began going through the South Caucasus, and they began going through Pakistan, through the Khyber Pass. These began the whole process of a reformulation of how the United States looked at this part of the world. And it was very important because they began to look at it differently. What happened in an evolution of American policy that started with after 9/11 began a tragic shift in 2010 in the 2008 time period. In 2008, we had the Russia-Georgia war, which began, followed the U.S. policy, what they called the reset, the U.S.-Russia reset policy. And this policy began a period of time where the United States began to distance itself from Georgia and began to focus on redeveloping relations with Russia. And it first and foremost priority was to protect the supply routes of providing the supplies to Afghanistan and maintain good relations with Russia and the Medvedev government. And this was a very important phase in this whole policy. Now, also during this period of time, the United States began training countries like Georgia and Azerbaijan and other countries in Central Asia began participating in American-led peacekeeping operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this developed a concept of peacekeeping. In the case of Georgia, it began a policy of what actually in their whole national strategy and defense doctrine, it led these countries like Georgia to change their defense policy structure so that they began participating in these peacekeeping operations, and it had a very dramatic effect on their military force structure because their military began to be trained for these types of operations. Now, Azerbaijan also participated in these operations, and so did Armenia. Armenia was following Azerbaijan and Georgia, developing ties with NATO and developing a very strategic aspect of this type of relationship with the United States and NATO. And this is where was a very important phase in this development. Now, when I would characterize these developments, the 2010 period is what we call the U.S.-Russia reset policy, but then I would characterize there's a new policy emerging of what I call the post-2013 policies of the United States, which I call the Snowden phase. And that's where we currently find ourselves during this period. Now, when you talk about national security and the security framework of the Caucasus, there's several things that I've mentioned. One is the Partnership for Peace program. The second thing is peacekeeping, participating in Kosovo. And then the other thing is the development is what we call the third issue, which is called Expeditionary Warfare. And this is when countries participate in military operations like Iraq and Afghanistan and participate in military forces. And in this case, countries like Georgia, and as well as Azerbaijan, that participated in Iraq and Afghanistan, but really particularly Georgia, were very strongly involved in this type of expeditionary warfare where their forces, their military forces were trained for these types of operations. Now, in the case of Georgia, the issue of expeditionary warfare became tragic because the Georgian military, during the 2008 war, over 2,000 of the best trained Georgian troops were in Iraq, and many of these troops were trained by the United States, but they couldn't get back to Georgia. And this is now, it created a major defense problem for Georgia because they changed their defense doctrine, they changed their military strategy to helping the United States and participating, but at the same time they could not, they were not prepared for what we call homeland defense, or defending the homeland. And this now is leading to a very important phase for the next 20 years. Why is this important? Because when we look at security in the region, and you try to talk to Georgians today about participating in overseas operations, they are now participating in Afghanistan, and they're now providing a very powerful role there, fighting in one of the most dangerous provinces there in Afghanistan, in Helmand province. But at the same time, they're gaining very valuable military experience. There is now a debate inside NATO and among the NATO countries over this issue of homeland defense. The countries of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are very much against and opposed to this idea of expeditionary warfare. And what they saw with the 2008 war and the Russian invasion of Georgia led them to believe that they needed to focus their defense strategies on homeland defense and not expeditionary warfare. And these are leading to some new trends and developments in the security landscape of the South Caucasus. Why? It's important because with the Russian military developments and buildup that's occurring, it is changing the threat environment. It's changing the way that the Baltic states, the way that Finland and Sweden look at the military situation in the Baltic. This is important because now inside Sweden they're having a debate on whether to join NATO. Finland has now announced that it's going to join NATO's Rapid Response Force. Last week in Washington, the Defense Minister of Georgia, Irakli Alasanya, announced that Georgia has been asked by NATO to also join the Rapid Response Force. So now you have other countries becoming involved in this because of the changing security environment. And this is changing a lot of what's happening and will affect the South Caucasus. It will affect the South Caucasus because these types of developments in the Baltic will have an impact here. It will affect Russia's defense posture. What is happening inside the borderlands of the post-Soviet space now are very, very important. And at the end of May, you had the announcement and the surprise decision by the Russian military to move the demarcation zone in South Ossetia 300 meters inside Georgian territory. This was a provocation that began a major debate inside the Ivanishvili government over its proposals and ideas to reach out to Russia. It also affected the discussion on intensifying Georgia's desire to get into NATO. And last week, there was a very important statement made by the Defense Minister of Georgia, where he announced that Georgia may not be a member of NATO, but is being increasingly treated like it is a member of NATO. In other words, it is being called upon by NATO to act and respond in a way that assists NATO in its operations. Even though it's not a member, it's being treated like it is a member. And this is a very important distinction. It is important because Finland is also now rising up and providing assistance to NATO, wanting to volunteer. They're having a debate inside their country on NATO. And this is affecting and will affect the region, because what happens in Georgia affects also the security situation in Azerbaijan, as we all know from the 2008 war. But at the same time, you're seeing by the United States a desire to become less involved in this part of the world. The debate over whether the U.S. will become involved in Syria and attack Syria over the use of chemical weapons is a very important debate. But right now, there's no debate about Georgia and the Caucasus. And what is happening with there still exists in this region a security vacuum. So what we're seeing is Turkey, Georgia, and Azerbaijan now engaging in cooperation in their own joint defense industries and developing strategic cooperation. Turkey is building its first ever main battle tank, and even countries like Azerbaijan and Georgia are looking at buying these types of weapons. And these types of developments are changing this environment. You've also in a non-military area, you have the EU partnership agreement, where the debate in Ukraine, whether Armenia and Ukraine are going to also participate in the European partnership agreement, is also changing the non-military aspects of security in the Caucasus. So in some ways, the debate is moving away from membership in NATO, in some cases, to the European Union and the role that it will play. And that brings us to the biggest strategic project of the past 20 years, and that is the idea of Putin's Eurasian Union. In 1991, you had George Bush announce his idea of the New World Order. Then in 2003, you had the Iraqi invasion, and you had President George W. Bush announce what they called the Freedom Agenda. And then in 2013, you have President Putin announced the concept of the Eurasian Union and the idea of integration. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton warned about the dangers of the Eurasian Union. She said that it reminded her of Putin's efforts were an effort to recreate the Soviet Union, and she expressed alarm and concern about this development. So on the one hand, you see this region, and you see the role that Azerbaijan and the Caucasus play, and Azerbaijan has so far announced that they're not going to join the part of the Eurasian Economic Union, but they've expressed, as well as Georgia, their firm desire to be a part of the EU partnership program. And so these types of debates are affecting, in some ways, the security environment, but also the non-military, the economic aspects of this environment. So you've seen the developments with the changes in infrastructure in the past 20 years to now there's an entirely new debate about where this part of the world may be directed and going. And Azerbaijan and Georgia have played a very important role in this. Armenia is even having its own debate on whether it wants to join the EU partnership program as well. They haven't announced whether they're going to join the Eurasian Economic Union yet or not, but they're also asking Russia, what are we going to get from it? Because they themselves don't see too many benefits to get from this Eurasian Economic Union when they're a landlocked country with no access to these markets. So these are the type of debates that I think that will very much influence things. I would like to note that that when we think about security in this region, it's very important to remember that there's many young civilian experts inside Azerbaijan and in Georgia that are emerging, and they have many very useful ideas. And I think I've heard on several occasions, some of my Azeri friends have expressed a lot of discussion about the new $4 billion in Russian arms that are being sold to Azerbaijan, which was a shocking development that was announced during, President Aliyev announced during Putin's visit. I think it's very important with a new group of civilian military security experts that are becoming and taking on new roles in the government, that it's increasingly important that decisions about military defense and doctrine be played by those new experts and not just be the area for involvement by the military. because in the United States and in Western democracies, it's very important to distinguish between the civilian role and the military role, and that the civilian oversight of the military. And I think that it's very dangerous when you begin to put all your emphasis on the new weaponry that you're getting and not developing a modern military doctrine to back that up. And that's very important because Georgia made a mistake in its war in 2008. Its military doctrine that was imposed by the United States actually ended up being very devastating and affecting its the homeland security. And I think that when a new generation, next 20 years, emerges in Azerbaijan, that they play an increasing role in the debates on their country's national security, and that they can go back and they can read the works of Samuel Huntington, who wrote a very important book in 1956 called The Soldier and the State, that talked about the importance of civil-military relations. And this is very important. And I think that it's important that that debates occur. They may not be public, but they should occur to discuss what is happening inside the country and its national security doctrine. And I think that this will play a very important role because we must remember that the situation in Karabakh remains very dangerous. Every week there are people that are snipers, the people are killed in Karabakh. It remains a very volatile conflict. And this part of the world remains very dangerous. And Azerbaijan and Georgia have achieved a lot in the last 20 years. And they've become very successful states. But there's still many dangers to their national security, and that their path to the West remains important. But it's also important that they have greater civilian and military integration in society, and that they can play a very important role. And I'm very hopeful that the United States will continue to play a role in this region, but I'm not very hopeful because the current administration in Washington is not very observant to this region, unfortunately. They don't pay much attention to this part of the world, and it's very sad, but it is the case. And you have a new Secretary of Defense in the United States, Secretary of Defense Hagel, and he has traveled extensively to this region, understands it extremely well. But whether he will play a role in giving the United States greater focus and attention in this region, it really remains unclear and uncertain. And that is why countries like Azerbaijan look to allies like Turkey. They look for outside partners for strategic cooperation. And one of the greatest lessons that Georgia learned in 2008 war was, despite everything that it did with its relations with NATO and participation in peacekeeping operations, when the war came, NATO and the United States were not there for them. And they learned a valuable lesson that much of their security would have to be, they themselves would have to guarantee their security. And so this is very important because there still remains a very large security vacuum in this region. The Russian military is rearming. 75% of all the modern military equipment that goes to the Russian military goes to the 58th Division in the North Caucasus. So it's a this region still remains very much a very important area of contest of struggle. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for your attention and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to speak today.